Most stories teach us that heroism and recognition belong together. A hero saves lives, defeats impossible odds, and eventually earns a place in history. Their name is remembered because their actions mattered. It's such a familiar idea that we rarely stop to question it. But history is full of people whose actions changed lives while their names disappeared. People whose sacrifices survived only through the people they helped. And that's what makes Zack Fair such an interesting character. Because at first glance, his story looks like a classic heroic journey. A young man dreams of becoming a hero, joins Soldier, fights for his ideals, and gives everything he has for the people he cares about. Yet, when his story ends, almost none of the things we normally associate with heroism are waiting for him. What remains is something much harder to measure. A single life he managed to save. And that raises an uncomfortable question. If an act changes the future, that the person responsible is forgotten, does that make the act any less heroic? Final Fantasy VII seems to have a very specific answer to that question, and the answer begins with Zack Fair. When Zack talks about becoming a hero, a soldier, it's tempting to interpret that dream as a purely personal ambition. He grew up in a world where heroes already existed, or at least where society claimed they did. The soldier program occupied a unique place within Shinra's culture. It's elite, first class. They were symbols. The public knew their names. Their victories were celebrated. Their image was inseparable from the idea that Shinra was protecting the world. Above all, stood Sephiroth. Long before the events of Final Fantasy VII, Sephiroth had become something larger than a military officer. He represented the ideal soldier, the proof that extraordinary strength, loyalty, and sacrifice could elevate an individual above everyone else. For someone like Zack, that image was impossible to ignore. He wanted to become a hero because heroes meant something. They protected people. They inspired others. They gave people hope. Angeal offered a more personal version of that ideal. Unlike Sephiroth's almost mythical reputation, Angeal treated heroism as a moral responsibility. His lessons focused on honor, integrity, and protecting others. Many of the values Zack carries throughout his life can be traced directly to Angeal's influence. At first, these two visions seem compatible. One presents the hero as a public figure. The other presents the hero as a moral example. But Crisis Core gradually reveals a tension between them. Because the more Zack learns about the world around him, the harder it becomes to believe that recognition and virtue are the same thing. The institutions that celebrate heroes are not necessarily guided by heroic principles. The people held up as symbols are often carrying burdens the public never sees. And the system responsible for creating legends proves increasingly willing to sacrifice individuals in order to preserve its own image. What begins as a simple dream therefore becomes a much more complicated question. What heroism was supposed to be? The image of heroism that shaped Zack's early life depended on a simple assumption, that the people standing at the top deserved to be there. As long as that assumption remained intact, the system made sense. Sephiroth was the greatest soldier. He embodied the qualities people admired, stands with Shinra in protecting the world. Soldier represented excellence. Heroes were recognized because their actions reflected genuine virtue. Crisis Core gradually dismantled that belief. Genesis is one of the first cracks in the foundation. Once celebrated as one of Soldier's greatest members, he becomes living proof that status and admiration reveal very little about a person's actual condition. The public sees a legend, but behind that image is a man falling apart physically and psychologically. Angeal presents a different kind of contradiction. More than anyone else, he tries to live according to the values that Soldier claims to represent. Yet his story ends with Shinra treating him as a problem rather than a person to be understood. Then comes Nibelheim. For Zack, this is more than a catastrophic mission. It is the moment when the gap between appearance and reality becomes impossible to overlook. The truth surrounding Sephiroth's origins, the experimentation conducted by Shinra, and the company's willingness to conceal its own actions reveal a system that depends on controlling information. The image presented to the public bears little resemblance to what is actually happening behind closed doors. Zack's dream was built on trust. Trust that the heroes he admired represented something real, that Shinra stood for something meaningful. As those assumptions collapse, Zack is left with a problem that the world around him cannot solve for him. If institutions can manufacture heroes, hide the truth, and discard people when they become inconvenient, then public recognition can no longer serve as proof of moral worth. The title of hero suddenly becomes far less important than the actions themselves. And once that distinction appears, Zack begins moving toward a version of heroism that exists independently of Shinra, Soldier, and the approval of everyone around him. By the end, Zack has lost almost everything that once connected him to his dream. He is no longer serving the organization that shaped his ambitions. The people he admired are gone. The institution he trusted has revealed its true nature. Even his future has become uncertain. What remains is Cloud. When Zack escapes Shinra Manor carrying an incapacitated Cloud with him, the scale of his world becomes dramatically smaller. The fate of Soldier no longer matters. Corporate politics no longer matter. Public recognition no longer matter. His responsibility is reduced to a single human being. On paper, this is the least significant period of Zack's life. He is not participating in famous battles. He is not receiving promotions. He is not building a reputation. No one is documenting his actions. Yet this period reveals more about his character than any military achievement ever could, because Zack continues making the same choices even after every external reward has disappeared. He could abandon Cloud and focus entirely on his own survival. Instead, he spends months protecting someone who is completely catatonic, unable to stand on his own, and entirely unaware of the dangers surrounding them. This is where the discussion moves toward the person he actually became. Earlier in his life, heroism was associated with titles, recognition, and public admiration. During the journey across the continent, none of those things remain. What remains are the values themselves. The distinction is important. A person can pursue recognition because they want to be seen as heroic. A person can also continue acting according to their principles after recognition becomes impossible. The second version is much harder to maintain because it depends entirely on conviction. Nobody would have blamed Zack for walking away. Nobody would have known if he had. And that is precisely what makes this chapter of his life so significant. For the first time, Zack's actions exist completely outside the systems that once defined heroism for him. Shinra is not there to reward him. Soldier is not there to validate him. Public opinion is not there to acknowledge him. The only thing guiding his decisions is the belief that another person's life is worth protecting. By this point, Zack no longer resembles the young man who dreamed of becoming a hero. Without fully realizing it, he has already become one. By the time Shinra's forces reach him, the outcome is already structurally determined. He is outnumbered, exhausted, and no longer part of any system capable of protecting or preserving him. The confrontation is brief, and there is no ambiguity about its result. From the perspective of Shinra's narrative, Zack ceases to be relevant at the moment he becomes inconvenient. This is where the idea of history written by the victors becomes more precise. They decide what is preserved at all. The absence of a record is an active construction of reality, where certain events are allowed to exist publicly and others are removed entirely from collective memory. Zack falls into the second category. Yet the consequences of his actions remain intact. Cloud survives. The chain of events that will later define the conflict with Sephiroth continues to exist. In other words, the outcome of Zack's life is fully integrated into the world, even though his presence is not. This creates a structural contradiction between memory and causality. The world behaves as if Zack's contribution never existed, while simultaneously depending on it. That contradiction is resolved only at the level of individual experience. Cloud carries what remains of Zack's identity, even if fragmented and unstable. He becomes the point where Zack's existence continues to operate, outside of official records and institutional memory. From a systemic perspective, Zack is erased. From a human perspective, he is transmitted. The difference between those two forms of existence is what defines the final implication of his story. Heroism, in this context, is not validated by recognition. It is validated by consequence. And consequence does not require an audience. Cloud survives because Zack chose to act. The events of Final Fantasy VII unfold because of that choice, regardless of whether anyone remembers who made it. Zack is not preserved by history, because real heroes rarely are. What endures is the legacy they pass on, even after their name has disappeared.